Before I go through with the results, I would like to introduce a little bit about the background of this paper. It's actually a kind of a staged outputs for an ongoing project with a international collaboration between academia from universities in Australia, in US, as well as in Hong Kong. So we're going to select 4 international cities, which are actually being named as the global financial centers, trying to make it more like a descriptive but phenomenon identification of the COVID-19's impacts of the local crime change. So we focus on the change parts rather than the crime trend itself. We would like to present the results both temporally and spatially. So the paper is not going to be a very fancy, cutting-edge algorithm or methodological innovation paper. Instead, it's more targeting with the policymakers, especially the local policymakers or the urban planners, to disclose how about the intensity and the types or categories of crimes had been significantly affected by the outbreak of the pandemic, and which part of the city, or to be specific, where of the city has been affected disproportionately by the pandemic, especially driven by the change of the mobility within the city. And thirdly, how about these trends could be applied in future predictions, especially trying to give some suggestions to local policymakers about their strategies on future crime prevention, especially how about they set up the crime priority strategy, or they're going to decide the places they would like to pay more attention to in the future. So the general picture, I don't know whether, I don't know whether this video window has affected the wheel, just in case it doesn't.
I can see the slide on your mouse as well.
Oh, that's great.
Do you see anything wrong?
Yeah, I see the float window of our videos as well. So I thought it's
yeah, no, it's not covering the slide. So for me,
oh, that's great.
So it seems fine.
So I'll go ahead. So this is the general trend over the decades about the crimes in London. Let's forget about any data before 2014. This is because the the recorded methodology of the crimes in London. Since 2014 ongoing, we can see a clear increased trend of the crimes, especially with some significant seasonal patterns. However, during the lockdown, we can see a very significant cliff drop of the crimes, especially since February 2020. Okay, so I make a note here, which is actually the starting date of the first lockdown in London, 23rd March 2020. And since then, we had experienced the first lockdown, which is 5 weeks long, from 23rd March until 10th May. Then afterwards, we had a temporarily lift or ease of the lockdown, which starting from 3rd August until the end, which is 31st August, when UK had propelled a national Eat Out to Help scheme. So I take it as a research period 2 in my following slides, which trying to compare or trying to tackle how the lift or ease of the lockdown policy had driven the specific types of crime change. And the third period, we see a second drop of the crime is actually the second lockdown, starting from 31st October until 2nd December. We are still keeping an eye looking at the data in the third lockdown, which ended by early April, as well as the second lift, which is the whole month for April. So once the data get out, we're going to add into our research. So this is kind of the background picture, the whole picture, and this helps us to select the research period. The first period is the first lockdown from March until May. So I put it here as March, April, and May, which actually included all the first lockdown period. And the second research period for my paper is the August 2020, which is actually the Eat Out to Help scheme when rolled out. So this can be taken as a lift, the temporary lift of the lockdown policy. And the third period is the second lockdown period. I take November as the monthly comparison. So from this map on the top, this is the absolute volume or intensity of the crime change comparing to 2019. Of course, we can compare it to 2018, 2017, but so far I only present the results comparing to 2019. And also this is a ratio of the crime change rather than the absolute volume of the crime change. So we can see clearly during the lockdown period, which is March until May and November, actually included the lift period, which is August. The property crime or acquisitive crime, including theft and robbery, had actually saw a significant drop over the whole pandemic period in 2020. However, during the lockdown period, which is March until May and November, actually we saw a significant increase of a specific type of crime, which is the drug offenses. So this is the volume, both the volume and the ratio saw the increase. During the lift period, which is August in 2020, the expressive crime, which we normally take it as violent crime, for example, possession of weapons, violence against the person, as well as public order offenses, has saw the increase. So these are these specific categories of crimes we're going to looking at. So I just put the summarize here. The significant change has been experienced or witnessed for drug offenses during the lockdown period, especially in April and May. The theft and the robbery, which can be taken as the acquisitive crime, had dropped significantly over the throughout the whole period, research period in 2020. The expressive crime, including different types of crimes for not only in the public order offenses, violence against the person, but also sexual offenses, had increased during the period, especially in August. So these types, three categories of crimes will be the main types to be looked at in the research. So trying to link the observation so far, or exploration of the data so far, to some traditional crime theories, we had collaboratively worked out the three main theories, which all point to one indicator, mobility change. For example, for the property crime or acquisitive crime, for example, robbery, theft, or even burglary had dropped significantly over the period. We can see this is we can propose the hypothesis that it's because of the reduction of the opportunities on the streets. So we had to go back to the crime opportunity theories, and again, it has been backed by the mobility change. Also routine activity theory, because people, or majority of the people, had been work from home, which had actually increased the guardianship of their own home or around the area, can kind of play the role as a guardianship included in the routine activity theory. And as a result, the burglary rate had decreased as well. And the last but not least is the general string theory in sociology. because we can observe the outburst of the expressive crime in August, especially when the lockdown policies has been temporarily lifted up. So we have proposed the hypothesis that this is because of people just want to, temporarily to resent. It's called the tension resenting crime, to express their tensions or strains through in the expression of violence, probably. So these are the hypotheses, all backed up by mobility change. So in the following slides, I'm going to present what kinds of the methods we are going to mainly looking at, which is actually provided by the Google Mobility Report. If you had the experience dealing with the data about the Google Mobility Change report, this is a report actually for London, and we can see the clear mobility change in the 2 lockdown period and the August, which is the lift up period. The mobility has dropped in both lockdown period, but increased definitely in August. And we're going to keep an eye on the data for April this year, as well as the 3rd lockdown from the January 2021 until early April 2021 as well. Okay, so based on the hypothesis, we are going to explore the relationship between crime change, especially the specific categories of the crime change, as well as the mobility change in London. But unfortunately, the data, especially the data from Google Mobility Report, only be available at borough level. So the data actually had divided the land use types or functional land use types in London into 6 categories, which including the grocery and pharmacy, supermarkets like that, workplaces, residential places, the transit stations or transportations, as well as parks, and the retails and recreations. Through the data exploration or exploratory data analysis, we had spotted significant change, especially in the land use type, parks, retail, and recreation. So I just put the results here for illustration purpose, but actually we worked out all the data for different types of crime, for different type of land use to work out finally land use composite index. So the index actually help us to make a projection of the land use types related or influenced mobility change at a finer scale, for example, LSOA, or even postcode level. So this is our expectation. We take the borough level, which is the currently available data, as the cognate weight, and trying to work out how about each LSOA in London, because in London we have over 4,800 LSOAs. So we would like to work out how about the land use type influenced mobility change among the LSOAs and how to compare their differentiations. However, for the land use data, we need to be consistent with the Google Mobility report. So we had scrubbed the data through the OpenStreetMap API, also trying to categorize them into 6 steps, and finally work out the land use composite index. The next step of our work is to project these kinds of the methodology or the index at the postcode level. I don't know whether this methodology seems reasonable to some of the academia in the field. If you have objections or other suggestions, please feel free to tap into the chat channel. That'd be so much appreciated. So this is kinds of the design so far. We had received some results, for example, the overall crime volume change. trying to identify the hotspots among the LSOAs in London over the 3 research period. Period 1 and 3 are the lockdown period, and period 2 is August 2020, which is kind of can be taken as the ease or lift up period. So from the result so far, we can definitely see the right color, which signify the increase of crime volumes, had been witnessed majority in the outskirts of London during the lockdown period. However, in August, the lockdown policy has been lifted up temporarily. The increase of crimes has been centered a little bit, but not in the city center. And the city center, especially the Westminster area, had just experienced a significant drop of crimes throughout the whole research period, which is great. And we have a strong hypothesis. This relates definitely to the reduction of the mobility. And the Heathrow Airport is also an area experienced a crime induction throughout the whole period. So in the future, we would like to take these areas as a case study to investigate more in detail.
And 5 minutes left. Sorry to interrupt. Okay. 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Thanks for the reminder. I can't see the clock. Okay. So for specific type of crime, we will only look into their increase or decrease periods. For example, the drug offenses, we only look into the lockdown period, and we can spot it out the hotspot LSOAs, which deserve further investigation. For acquisitive crime, for example, theft or burglary, or even robbery, we can see the experience drop, but there are also LSOAs experience increase, for example, the Heathrow Airport area in April. So we will look specifically into the Westminster area and the Heathrow area, as well as some LSOAs around the borders of London. This is the, yeah. For expressive crime, although we are going to mainly looking into August trends, but at the early stage of the first lockdown, which is in March, we also saw some violence against a person increased, especially in the Heathrow area. So we're going to investigate into this specific area as well, and some LSOAs. So this is the August results, and we can see the parcels had actually flattened out among several LSOAs, and there are some LSOAs deserve further investigations. So these are the case studies. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this. We just want to let you know what we did for the case studies. For example, at the Heathrow Airport area, we are going to add the data about the land use and the corresponding mobility change for Westminster City Centre. Similarly, rationale. This is the Hillingdon area because it has experienced the increase of the crimes, especially expressive crimes. The next step is we had used a machine learning algorithm to do the clustering of the LSOAs, compounding the data about the census data, and we are waiting for the updated census data to get out, as well as the deprivation index data. So we work out the clusters, and we would like to use the geographical weighted regression to figure out what kinds of the driving forces, not only in the mobility, but also the clustering profiles of the LSOAs could influence the local crime change in the future. So this is actually for the lift up period, for the lockdown policy lift up period, August, and trying to figure out the localized driving forces. So these are kinds of the summarization. We want to provide these kinds of the outputs and summarize the reports to local policymakers, suggest their to pay more extra attention to the potential hotspot areas about mobility-related crime decrease and increase, and accordingly taking measures to increase surveillance or pay more attention to the potential tension-resenting crimes increase, etc. These are kinds of the expectations for our next step work, which going to be wrapped up by summer this year. We would like to apply the random forestry algorithm for prediction purpose. And finally, this workflow. So the final output for the project is trying to work out a workflow which can be replicated for different global cities. And we're going to use this data or a workflow for both Sydney and New York and Hong Kong for comparison. Thank you.
I have a general question at the methodological level, and I was wondering if the pandemic caused changes in policing, and to what extent you can account for that in comparing a before and after scenarios. Because I would imagine that if policing changes very radically, also the number of crimes that are being reported and detected or prevented might change.
Yeah, thanks. That's really a brilliant question. Actually, we had discussed this with the Mayor's Office for Crime and Prevention. The police forces numbers or, the stuffs hasn't been witnessed a significant change, just like what we've seen for mobility. But the thing is, the functioning of the police had been changed a lot over the pandemic because they had to patrolling on the street and to tackling with the, some of the illegal getting together. So it's quite struggling for them to identify which kinds of the specific functions they are playing. So what we want to do is maybe we can pair the current research outputs with the stop and search data, which can partially reflect the police duties or functions. Because the statistical data for police forces hasn't changed that significantly. So we can't include it as a numerical variable into our model for prediction, but we can definitely suggest to some extent, for example, how about the stop and search, which can indirectly reflect the police force to some extent.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's just my anticipation.
Sure. No, these are really reasonable approaches. So we have a question from Andy Newton. I assume you're using open source crime data from police.uk. One of the challenges of using VAP it is that it will include outdoor, street, and indoor violence. Are you able to account for this as a hypothesis that physical mobility will reduce outdoor violence but might increase indoor domestic abuse?
Yeah, that's really brilliant question. That's what we are thinking of it as well. Yes, indeed, we use the open source data from the police, the Metropolitan Police website, definitely. But the thing is, that's why we want to include the land use data, especially the data script from OpenStreetMap, because then, especially for the case study area, because it's finer scale, so we can look into it and trying to compare the land use and trying to see whether the projected crime data, because the crime data can be projected as pinpoint on the map, so we can see whether it's really outdoor or indoor. So actually, this is a good question for another research topic, which is how the accuracy of the current police recorded crime data can reflect the real street level crime. This is a really great and inspiring question. So we would like to consider the land use data definitely to reflect the accuracy and test the accuracy. But also the indoor domestic abuse is currently a hot topic, especially for our collaborator from Sydney. They had reported a I think the latest data had reflected a significant increase of domestic abuse, especially sexual offences in Sydney area as well. So this is a specific crime tab we're going to look into in the next stage of the research as well.
Excellent. That's really interesting. And I would imagine that the reporting patterns for indoor domestic abuse are even more complicated to understand. And with the recent campaigns, whether that increases reporting or not. Fascinating work. In the meantime, I was wondering why you were using OpenStreetMap data for land use, considering that there's Ordnance Survey data that is probably more complete and more accurate.
Yeah, there are different types of the data sources, but the thing is, we would like to match it to the Google Mobility Report, and they define the land use data in another way rather than the Ordnance Survey or other. We get used to the, for example, remote sensing the land cover data. I want to revert the data into some type of the land use, but for current for consistency purpose, especially for comparative research among different cities from different continents, the struggling point is to figure out a channel or data source which could be identical for each other, use the same standard. So this is quite struggling and challenging point. And finally, we think, okay, maybe OpenStreetMap can help us in that way because they define the land use data by function. So yeah, that's kind of our initial thoughts, and we just go ahead with it because mainly from the comparative purpose, and finally think, okay, we need to be consistent with the Google Mobility and maybe more focus on the functionality of the land use rather than the real land use tab.
Right. No, I see your reasoning there. But one can always do sensitivity analysis and try different inputs. Right. Yeah. So our time is up. Thanks a lot. Actually, there's a recommendation from Andy. I recommend using ARIMA or similar analysis to adjust for seasonality, etc. And there's a link. So I hope you can see that in the chat, Yijing.
Thanks, Andy. That's so much appreciated. We're going to look into it. But actually, the seasonality of the crime trends in London is not that obvious compared to New York. New York has a really brilliant seasonality of the crime trends every year.
I'm not sure if brilliant is the sort of term, but
yeah, but it's anyway, abnormal last year, 2020. It's quite abnormal.